People who are off living it up in Vegas will have to find where they go later. Anyway, all right. So today, what we're going to do is work on just basic legal problem solving and cultural competence and those sorts of things. We'll talk a little bit about what these are, how you use them, how they play out in environmental law and so forth. And then on Wednesday, we will start in on our very first of the three major problems on grasslands and prairie dog conservation. So that's problem number one, and it's on Blackboard, just like today's readings were, and so forth. Your perspective assignments, I am grading them. I was a little busy Saturday playing volleyball, so that was fun. But anyway, so I did not grade them on Saturday. And then I had some other stuff I had to get done on Sunday as well. So I'm working on grading them, and I will, and basically I think what I'm going to do is just email you your grade and some feedback, okay? So it's a 5-point assignment, right? The whole point was to really master those 4 perspectives and start thinking about environmental law from 4 different perspectives, or just from different perspectives. So this framework here is what will guide you to answering the 3 major problems in the class. But hopefully it will guide you to a methodology that you will use in the practice of law for basically tackling any major legal problem that you have. You can use this in a sort of abbreviated, in an abbreviated way for simpler problems, but of course what we're doing in this class are large complex problems with multiple dimensions. You will get some of those in the practice of law. Now you will also get simple easy things that you just crank out in an afternoon or in a couple of days, of course, right? But if you can do the bigger stuff, you can do the smaller stuff. So the idea here is for us to tackle these big complex issues that you will get in the practice of law. And whether or not you ever do any environmental law in your practice, this basic methodology will still be useful to you in pretty much almost anything that you do. It's probably the area where it's sort of least applicable has to do with criminal prosecution and defense, but even there, you might have clients, either as a prosecutor or as a defense attorney, you might have situations where you're trying to solve some bigger issues rather than just figure out, whether the defendant goes to jail or not or something like that, okay? So, so the basic framework is you start out defining the problem. Another way that we term this is framing the problem. And this is sort of the big picture perspective of what the problem is all about. Okay? So, as you see, number 2 is listing the issues. So when we're talking about defining or framing the problem, this is the sort of thing that, say you get in an elevator and you're going up a few floors to maybe to a meeting or something like that, and somebody says, "What is this problem about?" This is what you should have, right? Whether you're basic, whether you call it elevator speech or whatever, but something you can say in a few sentences that gets at the heart or the essence of what the problem is about. If you are engaged in some sort of litigation, whether it's a trial level or whether it's an appellate argument, This is also what you want to be doing, right? You want to be able to frame the problem so that the judge or judges understand exactly, your way of looking at the problem, the way that you want to get them to look at the problem. Okay? This will also help in terms of like negotiation and other kinds of things, dealing with the public, the media, and so forth. In addition to the big picture frame, you will also want to identify the client's goals. So that's kind of like a sub thing. So you want the big picture frame that's going to be anywhere from 1 to several sentences, and then you want to identify what the client's goals are. Some other ways of thinking about it are client's needs, client's interest, right? But basically, what is your client needing or wanting out of this? And you can see that already thinking about legal problem solving is different than a purely academic analysis where we might take a more objective view, right? We might look at various parties' needs and interests, or we might, we might not be looking at any particular party's needs or interests. We might be just sort of as an academic observer framing the problem. But if you're engaged in legal problem solving on behalf of a client, you will have the client's goals, and those may be similar or different to your own personal interest and goals. And to some degree, we're going to talk about that with the cultural competence. Then you're going to want to list the issues. And in these complex problems, there are often multiple issues. One of the most effective ways to list issues is to think more in outline form, where you have the larger issues and then sub-issues. Right? And we will see that as we get along into the material. So for example, when we get into issues related to, say for example, the Endangered Species Act. Okay, so we might have a broader issue about compliance with the Endangered Species Act and a variety of sub-issues related to, say, a biological opinion, the type of science that's involved, administrative agency discretion about selecting various mitigation measures, etc. Right? And so there could be a variety of sub-issues. Third thing you want to do is describe the context. What are the causes of the problem? And what's the environmental context, the social context, and the institutional context? And context, by context I mean sort of the bigger picture in which the problem arises, the circumstances, the broader sort of set of things happening in the world in which this particular problem arises, and that affect the creation of the problem and the solutions, the possible solutions. So what were the causes of the problem? But then when we talk about the environmental context, we want to know some information about, what kinds of environments are we talking about? What are some of the features of those environments? Social context. By social, I mean society, including politics, economics, available resources, funding and otherwise, culture, and by culture, this is sort of the values and the ways that people look at these issues and that kind of stuff. And then sort of social interactions, communities and groups and so forth. And so you want to think about all of that. Institutional context is really about governance. Okay, what's the system of governance or systems of governance that influence this? So when we talk about institutions, we're not talking just about organizations. So sometimes people refer to U of L as an institution of higher education, or that kind of thing. And so maybe they mean institution, but sometimes really what they mean is just organization, right? But an institution is a system or set of rules that govern how people behave. And those can be legal rules, so we have law as an institution, we have legal institutions. It can be more policy-oriented, governance institutions, so ways in which decisions get made and choices get made within the government. But they might also be informal or non-governmental, so social norms are actually institutions, and so forth. So, for example, one of the things we'll see when the other people who aren't here today show up how this works, but generally, we do not have any rules about where you sit in class, but once you've staked out a place, the norm is nobody else better sit in your seat, right? I mean, isn't that pretty? That's an example of, has become institutionalized. Actually, every law school operates this way, and I mean, it's just fascinating to watch the dynamics. If somebody sits in somebody else's seat, there are at least 6 people in the room that tell them that person's in the wrong seat, or they need to move because somebody else sits there, right? I mean, that's an institution. And there are other sorts of things. So you need to sort of think about that context. And part of what we're talking about there is sometimes the decisions are going to get made and the solutions are going to get reached outside of more formal systems. Maybe actually very informal ways of resolving the issues. So maybe not in the courts, and so forth. So that's something to sort of think about when you're describing the context. Next thing you'll want to do is investigate the facts. In this class, you have a variety of facts that will be made available to you through assigned readings. In this case, investigate basically means do the readings. So that's easier, it's more straightforward. And so when it comes time to doing the final paper, you do not have to do any additional outside research. Everything that you need to answer the problem is available to you, and if there's unknown facts that you would like to know, you can simply indicate, in order to solve this problem, I would also want to know X, Y, and Z, right? I mean, but you do not have, this class does not expect you to do any additional research. If you're in the field study class, the whole point of that is factual investigation skills. So the whole point is for you to actually do research, and so it makes a nice pairing, right? So you spend more time on number 4 in the field study class. Investigate the law. So again, the law will be provided to you in the readings. But you'll discover that as we go through the course, there's actually a fair amount of environmental law. We are not covering anywhere close to all of it, but by the end of the semester, you will feel like we've covered all of it, and then some, because there's a lot of environmental law. And so somewhere, I gotta find it, but somewhere or other, there's some sort of picture of all of the federal statutes and code of federal regulations that deal with environmental issues, and it's like, huge. And then there's like tax, and it's like this much, right? And so, and we have like how many ever zillion tax classes here at the law school, and we have one environmental law course, and the faculty don't get it. I mean, they're like, oh, environmental law, some sort of specialized subject. Like, I mean, I don't know what they think. We just, we go out and hug the prairie dog, and then, what? I don't know. I mean, so I'm like, no, there's a huge amount of law, and we're only covering part of it. But that's okay, because the whole point here is for you to understand environmental law as a system, as a way of going about this. Actually, the law is so detailed and so complex that you would never do it. I mean, you never master it in just even maybe 4 courses. I mean, so lots of people who really do environmental law seriously will take as many courses in law school as they can, and then they will get an LLM. And then they're still learning the law out in practice because there's just a huge amount of law. It's all very, very regulatory, very technical, and so forth. But in this class, it will be reading the materials and so forth. Next step is generate possible solutions or options or alternatives, whatever you want, whatever term you want to use. But this is the sort of brainstorming about what are some possible solutions. And this will be a big part of, of our, when we kind of have worked our way through the material for each of the 3 problems, one of our class sessions will be really about doing that, and then applying the legal analysis and non-legal analysis. So what we're going to do on Wednesday is this kind of stuff, and then we're going to spend a lot of time doing this over several class sessions, and then at the end we're going to do this. Okay? And when you develop solutions, you start out brainstorming. Okay? Anybody have any sort of understanding or sense of what brainstorming involves?
Well, everything stays on the table at first, and maybe you can eliminate things later, but you shouldn't eliminate things first.
Exactly. It's just put it all down, right? Let the mind run. Get the ideas down as quickly as you can. Put them down. Don't start screening things out to begin with, because your most brilliant idea might be something that you would have totally discarded, right? In the moment, that's stupid, right? Okay, so brainstorming involves, just letting the creative juices flow, putting everything down, getting the ideas, and then you can evaluate later, right? And you can look at them through legal analysis, through non-legal analysis. But eventually, when you are going to select some solutions, you should think about solutions that count as strategies, and strategies are general directions that you want to take. Okay, so in planning, so the field of planning, we generally start with goals, but you've already identified clients' goals over there, right? And you've framed the problem. So that's really kind of number 1. And then we talk about strategies. Strategies are ways that you can move forward in more of a general direction. So where do you want to go? And then specific action items are the things that you will do, right? The things that you will do in order to implement the strategies, in order to effectuate and get them to happen. Okay, so you want to think both broadly about strategies. So one strategy that often comes up if you are a lawyer for an environmental group is sue the heck out of the government and the polluter, right? So that's right. Bombs away on the litigation, right? So that is a strategy. So to just litigate this as vigorously as possible. But specific action items would be like, filing the NEPA lawsuit, filing the ESA lawsuit. Maybe you want multiple lawsuits. You got to put them all together, right? Okay, so that you start thinking through the details of that. What would that look like? What kinds of remedies would you think that might be would seek? What kind of remedies would you seek? That's a specific action item. Then you are going to apply your legal analysis to the problem and possible solutions. In this class, that will be quite extensive because problems are complex, the solutions are many, and the law is quite extensive. Okay, so when you're actually developing your analysis for, say, the final paper, whatever, number 8 is quite lengthy. But you will find, as we kind of go through this, that number 9 will also be fairly lengthy. Non-legal analysis. What do we mean by non-legal analysis? During the course, we're going to think about various non-legal factors that affect the solution of these problems. Okay, so things like politics. What are the politics that are involved? Resources. Where are the resources going to come? And you can reach all kinds of legal outcomes. The court can order X and you can sue for Y and so on and so forth. It is all you want, but if the resources aren't there, not going to happen. Not going to happen one bit, right? And occasionally there'll be even situations where the court requires the Secretary of the Interior, or the Administrator of the EPA, or the assistant, or deputy, or whatever, to come into court and tell them why the court order isn't being implemented. And very often, even though it makes the judge extremely irritated, if they say, Congress has not authorized any funding for the implementation of this order, and we don't have any funds, any resources in which to do it, I mean, that's a separation of powers issue, right? The court can't force it. I mean, of course, court's not going to force Congress to appropriate the money for it. And so, lo and behold, there aren't resources. And so, generally what the court will say is, okay, once any resources become available that can be used on this, you have to implement the court order at that time. But, so it's just to call your attention to the fact that resources is a big issue, and that is not often really solved by legal edict. It's solved by other things, and politics plays a role in that. Social issues. This is a place where we might sort of be looking more at some of the cultural competence issues, and so on and so forth. They're going to be also. We're going to get into some of the science and ecology. Like I said, you do not have to know anything about it. It's all going to be explained to you in layperson language, but you do have to pay attention to that, right? I mean, you have to pay attention to what it is that we're trying to do. Say, for example, if we are protecting grasslands and the habitat of prairie dogs, what do they need? What does that mean? And so forth. And so that may be where you sort of raise those issues here at number 9. Then you're going to choose or identify what are the best solutions or options or alternatives, or why they're the best. And so that's where you're going to reach your outcome, your solution, right? And then you need to implement them. And then over time, you need to evaluate, are these solutions actually producing the outcomes that we had hoped for, or not? And if not, why not? Now, numbers 11 and 12, you do not have to do in this course. We are going to be aware as we work along about of various examples of solutions that were not implemented, or that were implemented poorly, or that were implemented well, and look at how various outcomes in the real world about how things worked or didn't work and so forth. So we're going to be aware that those are relevant considerations, but in terms of what you're writing on your final paper, it sort of stops here with number 10, right? I mean, you can't on your final paper actually implement anything, right? It's a paper for class, and then you won't have any outcomes yet to evaluate. So does that make sense to everybody? Okay. All right. So questions about any of this? All right, so let's do a little bit of this. We're going to spend a lot of time over the course of the semester doing this with the 3 problems. But let's talk about the Martin County water crisis. And let's cherry pick a few of these, because I want to make sure we're going to spend time on the cultural competence issues. But in particular, how would you define or frame the Martin County water crisis? Somebody is, sitting at a bus stop waiting for a bus. You're sitting next to them. You say, "What are you working on?" You say, "The Martin County water crisis." They say, "I don't know anything about that. What is the nature of the problem?" the nature of the problem. Yeah.
I think I would say it's both like a humanitarian and environmental problem. That started long before the environmental problem became even a bigger issue, but mostly it's that the water in the county is either polluted or not even arriving in an adequate fashion to the residents.
Okay, so we've got both quality and supply issues for drinking water for the residents of the county that has both humanitarian and environmental dimensions. Okay, good. Yeah.
I would just add that it's been a long-standing issue, that the cold slurry spill was like 18 years ago at this point, and while there have been funds filtered into the county that could have repaired the problem with the infrastructure, those funds have been mismanaged, and as a result, there are a lot of people who are living in poverty who don't have access to good drinking water.
Okay, good. So this is a long-standing, deep-seated structural problem with providing basic drinking water to the residents of Martin County. Okay? To residents of Martin County, many of whom live in poverty. Okay? Good. What else? Anything else? Yeah.
Well, it seems to be like an entanglement between lots of like various smaller issues, right? You have issues with infrastructure, and then you have issues with politics, kind of self-dealing. You have issues with public involvement, and all of these smaller things, in addition to the cold slurry spill happening, and that not being the first one, kind of amalgamates into this large problem, which ends with people or with residents of Martin County not having reliable, quality drinking water or access to it because they turn the faucets on and off.
Okay. So you could call it the perfect storm of many things that aren't working well or that have gone wrong. Okay. Just another way of looking at it. What if I were to say you could look at the problem as a problem in lack of available resources to allow the government to meet its responsibilities to the residents. Okay?
I was just remembering that one of the biggest parts of it is that they are trying to pass on the expense of fixing all of this to the residents through a rate increase, and because they're paying for drinking water in bottles already and they live in poverty, this is not something that they feel like they can afford to do.
Okay, so you're framing it as an affordability issue for the local residents, and I think that's a way to frame it. But if I were to say to you, the problem is a lack of available resources to enable or allow the government to fulfill its responsibilities to the students.
We have lack of cold severance money now. So what was used in the past was used elsewhere, and there's multiple things else in the county that need to be taken care of besides just the water problem. So it's where do you actually put your resources, and those resources continue to diminish as the population decreases in the county.
Okay?
I would say it's not solely an issue of lack of resources. There's a lot of mismanagement and political corruption involved in those resources.
Okay.
So it's like, the resources might actually be there. It's just where they sit.
Okay?
Ditto.
Yeah.
There's a.
Okay?
There's little access to legal advocacy too.
Okay. Okay. Good. Good. So some pushback against framing it that way. That's, good. But if you were to hear that frame, who do you think that frame would be coming from?
What, your firm? Would be coming from the local government?
From local government, right? Okay, so let me sort of ask you this. If you were the attorney for the Martin County Water District, how would you frame it? Right? You would probably not frame it as, well, gee, we're basically corrupt and, you know, and we've been mismanaging the money, right? Right? I mean, think about this as a lawyer, right? Okay, you might personally feel like that's what's going on, right? But you would probably not publicly frame the problem that way, right? Does that make sense? Okay, now, you know, I'm not saying that you should frame it that way, but part of what I'm trying to get you to see is that different parties are going to frame the issues different ways. Okay? Now, so there's been clearly corruption and mismanagement. I think it's hard to avoid that. But if you were representing the Martin County Water District today, right, what did we say has happened? It's not one in your reading, but it's happened more recently.
Didn't they approve the rate increase? I don't remember.
So the Public Service Commission for the state improved the rate increase. Okay, so that's going to bring them some more resources. What else? What was it conditioned on? What was the rate increase? Yeah.
I think they reformed part of the Martin County Water District Board, correct?
Yeah. The board and
Some of the political leaders.
not just political leaders, the management team. Okay, they have an entirely new manager. They have an entirely new board. The state said, we will let you do this, but only if you clean house, right? I mean, that's really in essence what they're saying, right? I mean, they may not have said it that way, but in essence, they're like, you know, this is a mess. Okay, we will allow you to raise your rates, but only if you clean house. Why would they allow them to raise the rates? People are poor, right? They can't afford this. Why would the state allow the rate increase?
There's nowhere else for the money to come from. The state isn't willing to fund it, and there's no grants or anything.
Right. Yeah. So no, that's exactly right. Now they had one federal fund, some federal funding that was not used as required or expected, and there's a criminal investigation going on about that. But then since then they have gotten some additional federal funding. Okay, so it's not like but it's not enough, right? It's just not enough. Okay, so one of the things I want you to see is there is a piece of that even if that is burdensome or inequitable or whatever, it is nonetheless an accurate description that that we have a water district in a sparsely populated, highly impoverished, underinvested, corruptly mismanaged place that needs resources in order to be able to actually fix the problem, right? And so from the perspective of the lawyer for the water district, that's what you're going to focus on, right? If that's who you are and that's what you're trying to do is to solve that problem. And so, obviously, if you represent the residents, you're framing the problem as not only this history, this bad history, but you're framing it as the inequity of, having to double pay, of paying of cost of water beyond your client's means. All those sorts of things. That's you get different frames that way. Okay, so we talked extensively kind of about causes and the context and so forth in last class and some of that now. But I do want to sort of get you thinking about if you were representing the water district, what sorts of possible solutions would you come up with? And part of this is, not to say that that's the only role here, but I think many folks would find themselves more likely to just out of natural inclination represent one of the other parties, especially the local residents, right? You would sort of, I can tell there's sort of a sympathy, and that's good. I think that's great. But personally, but I'm just saying, if you were the attorney for the water district, put yourself in that role. What sorts of solutions might you think about?
What are businesses paying less per gallon
Uh-huh.
for water than residents? So we could make them pay the same amount, increase the cost for businesses.
Okay, so reevaluate the differences between commercial and residential rates. Okay, good?
If you're looking at privatization options for the water company itself and whether or not they can get cheaper infrastructure to update what's needed.
Right, okay. Now, there in the history of this, they looked into that at one time, and it didn't work out. But that's an option. You would want to look at that as, and again, sort of putting everything on the table. You want to generate a bunch of ideas. What else?
Well, I know there was basically they think that the investigation was whitewashed.
Mhm.
So maybe calling for another
Right.
investigation that would then enable you to go after more funds from the government
Okay,
or
so
the companies.
reopen the investigation, the coal slurry thing,
Yeah, also like investigate why they're moving so much water under the Bowie and also because of
Right. Okay, so one of the things you might really want to spend a fair amount of time focusing on is why is it that there is so much water loss, right? I mean, so where's that coming from? What's going on, right? I mean, if you represent the water district, that's got to be a high priority, and again, think about this: you're representing a new era in the water district, a new set of people who are more professional, and so while that may have been ignored in the past, you might want to suggest that in terms of the legal position of the water district, they're going to have to put a whole lot more into trying to figure out where that's coming from and you know, what's going on there, right? And what are the causes and so forth. Okay, good. What about process? What about working on solutions that will engage the public more productively? Okay, and so just hearings and so forth. So anyway, so instead of just sort of the typical hearings, could you have, you know, various like community councils or, you know, workshops or that kind of thing? Sit down and talk with the residents more. Who's on the board, right? Okay, so instead of, you know, the somebody who is, you know, connected in some way financially to development or the coal company or whatever, what if you had, you know, a broader range of local residents, maybe people who haven't historically been involved in the water issues? Yeah.
Also kind of outside of local residents, like trying to crowdsource things, even like get more support and attention. Obviously, it hasn't like fixed Flint's problem, but I
Yeah.
don't think that everyone in this classroom have heard of the Flint water crisis, and I embarrassingly had no idea that this was going on until we had this problem.
Right, right, okay. So, I mean, you need Matt Damon, right? I mean, you need some help, right? Exactly. Okay, good.
I was just thinking that because the board, although it may be removed, was brand new, they probably should be getting mentorship from people who have had crisis of any of the same kind of environmental problem. I mean, obviously it would have to be somebody that's close by, but they should be brainstorming with other counties or, you know, nearby regions or whatever to make sure that they're moving in a forward direction and have some accountability there.
Okay, good. Some mentoring, some guidance, some insights from other you know, water board members and communities that have dealt with similar kinds of problems, or you know, water management officials who've dealt with similar problems. I'm not entirely sure I agree that it needs to be somebody close by, right? There's a lot of technology. They could Skype in their mentorship or whatever. Now, having said that, you know, is it possible that Flint, Michigan, and Martin County, Kentucky, are different enough that kind of those insights might not be as useful, and you might have to think carefully about, you know, who would offer insights, you know, who, you know, where are you going to get that? But exactly. Okay. So we can keep going, right? You see kind of the brainstorming and so forth, but if you have a particular client with a set of goals, a way of looking at the problem that helps you generate some solutions that will help, at least from your client's perspective, solve the problem, right? I mean, and so basically, in essence, most of what you're talking about in terms of solutions were thinking more creatively about various resources that will help you be a good water provider as opposed to a bad water provider, right? Just about boil it down to the basics. Okay, no pun intended on that. All right, okay, so anyway, but I want to turn now to the cultural competence. Again, continuing with sort of the Martin County example. But this course, part of it is that we are satisfying through the perspective requirement our ABA, our commitments to the ABA that every student will be will master the skills of professional skills of cultural competence, which is one of the ones that is listed in the ABA accreditation standards. But not just because the ABA wants us to do it or we told them that we're going to do it, but because it's a good thing. I mean, that lawyers need to be able to look at issues from multiple perspectives, from diverse perspectives, to consider the ways in which culture and cultural differences affect how people perceive legal problems, how different solutions are going to affect different people and different groups and so forth. And as I mentioned the other day, and as you could see in the reading on this, culture can have lots of different kinds of manifestations. So we are clearly going to look at, in this class, at issues affecting racial and ethnic minorities in the United States. Okay, so we'll get into some of the environmental justice issues in the last problem. Okay, that's going to be something that we're going to look at. We're probably not really going to do much international. So we're not really going to look at, say, for example, the ways in which the culture in China affects climate change negotiations at the international level. That's very interesting. But versus the culture in the United States versus the culture in India and South Africa and so on and so forth. Right? I mean, there's lots of different kinds of influences there. That's interesting. That's kind of we're so focused on U.S. environmental law here. But we're going to look at a lot of different kinds of things. So we're going to look at the ways in which different kinds of professions or different kinds of disciplines look at environmental law. So I promise you that the scientists and the technicians look at this very differently than the lawyers do, and that often leads to a fair amount of conflict. But also, lots of different manifestations. So let's talk a little bit about how different perspectives, different cultural perspectives influence the Martin County Water District situation. And if you were the new lawyer for the new management of the Martin County Water District, how you would, develop awareness of and openness to cultural differences. So let's start with that one. If you were doing that, if you were the lawyer, what would you do? Just as a professional.
Do you mean culture of like the actual water treatment plant itself, or culture of the community as a whole?
Well, generally when we talk about culture, we're talking about, what do you mean in terms of the plant? Are you talking about the employees?
Basically like the work environment or the community.
Okay, so you've identified at least two different cultural perspectives, the community perspective and the employee perspective. And the employees, there's a work culture. Okay, there's a culture of the law school, right? Yeah, exactly. You guys are like, oh God. Right? So yeah, but there is, right? I mean, so right? I mean, so work environments or academic environments have a culture. So the definitely there is an employee culture there in the district, and there is at least one community perspective or community culture. It may be more than that, but okay, and we'll talk about that. Okay, good. So you want to be?
Sure, I'll say community, especially if you're somebody, if you're an attorney that's not from there, or at least not from Eastern Kentucky, you need to immerse yourself to understand. You don't want to be seen as an outsider, because for one thing, you don't understand until you've been around everybody.
Right.
And then it gives you a better perspective going on that you can actually advise the water department on how to proceed on what the community is going to think is a beneficial use or solution to themselves.
Okay, good. Yeah.
That's very broad, open-ended questions, just because I feel like a lot of the people there feel like they're invisible or that their voices aren't being heard, so kind of just let them air out their grievances, basically.
Okay, good. So one of the things that you are probably already aware of, just because of this class, and open to is the fact that people are upset. People who live in the community are upset. And so we're already jumping down to, 2, 3, to other levels of saying, hey, we need to learn and understand, and that involves communication and listening in a way that is more open-ended. Okay? So this is one of, among many things, there are many things that lawyers do badly, but one of the worst things that we do badly is that we ask very directed, close-ended questions that already assume the answer, right? Okay, and I mean, if nothing else, just pay attention to what your professors do, right? I mean, right? They ask you ask you some question like, no, that's wrong. No, that's not the holding of that case, right? I mean, it assumes a set of right and wrong answers, or it makes some assumptions about what the problem is, and so forth. Okay, and I can tell you that people, non-experts in the community hate it. They hate it. They love open-ended questions. They want to tell you their story, okay? And that is challenging as a lawyer, because you're like, time is money, we got to move on. I'm already 10 steps ahead of you to some solution, and so forth, and you got to back up. You got to back up, and you've got to ask the open-ended questions, and you've got to listen, because there's going to be information in there that you need. There's going to be information there you need. And it is going to be partly just like more factual information, knowledge that you need, but it is also going to be about the tone, the emotion, that kind of thing, right? So, if for example, what you are hearing is parents who are getting very emotional about their kids, right? Coming in with your 6-point legal analysis is not. I mean, that's just, you're going to hit the wall like you're driving 60 right into the brick wall, right? I mean, that you are totally missing the context in which this is occurring. So you have got to listen to that, and that may involve tears. It may involve a lot of emotion. It might involve anger, but that's going to be part of the process. And that is, like I said, lawyers tend to get kind of in their tunnel vision of lawyering the situation, and that's part of the whole idea about cultural competencies, because then you miss what's going on, and then whatever your legal solution is becomes now the target of the anger or the emotion or whatever, or the the distrust. You're not listening to them. You're not right, and so forth. Okay, so that's going to be a part of it. What else? And let me say another thing. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm on a roll here, so let me run with this for a second. But this is what we do when we're looking at marginalized communities in the Resilience Justice Project. So when we go out in the communities, we ask a set of questions, and we have some that are some choices of, very much, some a little, not at all, right? Poor Taylor, she's got that. She can just roll that one off, right? So we have some questions that we ask like that, and it's in part in order to sort of gauge where on a spectrum. But most of our questions are open-ended, and oh my gosh, people will talk. They have lots of things to share, right? Some of them occasionally are not as particularly relevant to what we're doing, but they end up really appreciating that process, because now that rather than some academics at the university coming in and treating them like lab specimens to study, we've actually come in to listen to their story. And then that informs our understanding of what actually is going on in the community. So yeah, I will tell you that, for example, in the Parkland neighborhood in West Louisville, we probably would have come out with an analysis that was very heavy on some of the environmental and educational things. And at least those are big problems. But what we heard was that we also really have to pay attention a lot to the crime and safety issues. That those are, and they're all intertied, right? They're integrated, and so and that's not really as much our expertise. That's really other areas of the law school. But those are issues that affect the resilience of those communities that are interconnected with the fact that they don't have enough trees, enough parks, and so forth, and interconnected with the fact that they don't have a library and so on. So listening has made a big difference, and in part what we're doing with that process is communicating empathy and respect. Okay? All right? Now, you sort of say, okay, well, lawyers, we're not really social workers, we're not counselors, what really is this rule of empathy going to be? Well, a piece of it is just simply respecting people's perspectives. You might not agree, you might not choose to do what they want you to do, right? Okay, so cultural competence does not mean that you just now have to do whatever the other group or the other side wants to do, but it does mean that you need to respect where they're coming from, and to have some empathy for where they're coming from. And I hope that, we work on this, but there's this sort of growing awareness that this is something law schools could do better with their students, right? That there have to be standards and expectations. We have to prepare you well, so we can't sort of say, no, we feel empathetic about your desire not to take any exams this year, right? Right? There's some limits to that. But on the other hand, right, the sort of very rigid top-down approach, right, we find that ends up resulting in stress that impedes productive outcomes. Well, that's true. That's true with everybody. That's just a human thing. So empathy is an important part of what you're going to do as a lawyer. And again, it does not mean that you have to agree with where they're coming from. It doesn't mean that you have to. You may have a situation like, for example, how empathetic should the community's lawyer be about the coal slurry, or the coal company, or about the managers and so forth? Again, it doesn't mean that you have to say it's all right that you were corrupt and mismanaged us, or that you polluted our community. But on the other hand, think about what empathy in that scenario would look like. What would empathy, if you were representing the community and you're dealing with the coal company, or you're dealing with the water district?
I think especially with the coal company, because coal is just so integrated into that society, and that company probably gives a huge portion of the county their jobs. I think recognizing that and how helpful they are to their community, but also saying you can't just come in here and destroy everything. You have to help us responsibly as well.
Okay, good.
I think just like a spirit of cooperation and communication that you want to move forward. Like I understand, I hear you, I know where you are, but you also have to do the same thing for us, and how can we fix this? We are where we are.
Right, okay, good. Yeah, I mean, I think, focus on that sort of solution-oriented thinking. But also, I mean, we have developed a habit in our society recently about everything is an outrage of one sort or another, and blame has to be assigned everywhere. And there is a process, and there's a time and a place for assigning moral responsibility and assigning blame and so forth. But sort of, if you're thinking about what's going to help the community move forward, accusing the coal company of intentionally poisoning the community, okay, you might feel that way, but you might also want to sort of listen. Okay, what's going on? Was this, for example, an accident? That doesn't mean that you shouldn't be unhappy that they won't clean it up or whatever they're trying to grab, but it's also at the same time, if you're sitting down and trying to find a solution, you're not going to build a bridge by saying, by calling them names and attacking them, right? You're going to have to think about, okay, where are they coming from?
I think also going off that, the blame part, especially in small communities and small rural communities, everybody knows everybody and they're most likely related. So you don't go in and say and blame somebody specifically, because who you're talking to that may have been your ally could be that person's brother, cousin, best friend, whatever else, and then you just completely blown everything at that point, because they want to blame basically the institution but not the specific person that might have caused it.
Right. Okay, good. And I mean, you also have to sort of look at some of the bigger picture here, right? We all of this occurs in a political and economic system in which profits are corporate profits are valued. I mean, right? I mean, that's the system we're in, and we can critique that, or we can embrace it, or we can look at it in lots of different ways. But if you think that the company isn't thinking, quite a bit about how to reduce cost and increase revenues, right? You're just missing that's the corporate culture. I mean, you've got to at least understand that. Whether you agree with it or not, that's another story. But you've got to at least enter the conversation understanding that that's where they're coming from. Again, the water district officials, okay? They're trying to make things happen in a community that just doesn't have a lot of resources, right? Okay, now again, that doesn't mean say, oh, I'm so sorry and I feel so bad for you that you were corrupt and spent the money on, building your vacation home rather than what you saw. Okay, no, but again, when we're talking about empathy here, we're not talking about excusing bad things, but think about the current water management, right? They've come in with a difficult situation and they're trying to fix it. And they're not going to have all the right answers right away. They're not going to know everything that has gone on in that community. Yes, do they need to listen? Yes. Can they listen fast enough? Probably not, right? I mean, that's part of that empathy. It's going to take them time to figure out what's going on, to build those relationships. And so again, if you're representing the community, you want to sort of think about that. All right. So any other things on any of that? Okay. So let me just get down then now to the sort of equity and inclusivity. So one of the things that is very often the case in environmental law is that more powerful interests just simply have more control over the decisions, right? And we need to recognize that, and you ask, okay, who is not at the table? Who's not being included in the decision making? And again, that doesn't mean that you have to necessarily reach one decision or another. You don't have to sort of say, okay, well now, because because the residents are unhappy, we now are going to have, sort of the local residents decide whether or not there's going to be a rate increase. That might just not be practical, because again, it takes a certain amount of money to run the system, and whether they want to pay it or not, I mean, it just may be the reality. And the legal authorities invested in the Public Service Commission, not in the community residents. So, I mean, it might be a great idea to do that, but it might also not be a practical reality. So that's not exactly what we mean by equity and inclusivity. This is not sort of a requirement that you sort of send all decisions to the most marginalized group to make. But it does mean, are the marginalized groups included and empowered? And so there's a great article in the planning literature, relatively recent, a few years ago, and so forth, about distinguishing participation and inclusion. Okay? They are not the same. Participation is often about an opportunity to participate in some process that has been decided to be implemented by the people in power. So you know the situation, you know the examples, or you're familiar with examples where the government has to make a decision. Very often there is the standards tend to be somewhat biased towards a particular outcome. I mean, it may be in favor, maybe against, but it's, that you already have a set of standards. You already have a set of government experts that have their own analysis and so forth. You have a set of decision makers, whether it's a board or a commission or a whatever, right? And they're going to have a public hearing, okay? And the public hearing is going to be at some specified time, say Tuesday afternoon at 1 o'clock, okay? Right, so first of all, who is free at 1 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon to go to the hearing? And how's that hearing work? I mean, has anybody been to hearings like that? Government hearings? Okay, very formal, right? You have a limited amount of time to get up and say your thing, and most people, their experience with these, they hate them. Most people, I mean, so there's been all sorts of empirical studies. People hate these things because then they feel like nobody's listening to them. They're going, they're expressing their viewpoint, and the decision's really pretty much already been made, and the process is not really about listening. It's just about going through the hoops. And so yes, they've participated, but it is not an inclusive process. And it certainly isn't inclusive to anybody who can't get there at that time, or who, maybe they don't, maybe it's all going to be based on some sort of scientific or technical analysis, and they don't have that background, right? They're like, I'm here because my kid's sick, and the people are saying, well, it's 0.017 parts per million, and there's a big disconnect between what they want to say and what's being decided. So inclusion is about making sure all voices are heard. Again, it doesn't mean pick this voice over that voice. It doesn't require that, but it means it requires all voices, all relevant voices are heard, and that there's really more in the way of co-governance. So that it is, which means that the design of the decision-making process is shared by both the government officials and the communities and stakeholders that are affected, okay? The communities and stakeholders are affected. Now, again, don't get carried away. This definitely means local residents, like the residents of Martin County, the impoverished residents of Martin County, but when we're talking about stakeholders, it also means the development company and the coal company and so forth, right? They're also stakeholders in this. And so when we're talking about this broad inclusive approach, again, I just want to emphasize that it is generally, it means that people who've historically been excluded get to be a part of it, but are essential to be a part of it, but it also doesn't mean you are sort of saying, okay, well now other stakeholders are excluded. That's not how it works, okay? So that's become kind of an important process. And so just this past week, when you were working on your perspective assignment, I was speaking about resilience justice to the Ecological Society of America, which are primarily environmental scientists who are working on these kinds of issues with communities, and they have no idea how to do it. And they want to do it well, but they don't know what to do, right? Because they're scientists. They don't know really they don't know how to be empathetic. I know I'm saying, I'm teasing. But they don't know, how to design these processes. They don't know how to engage with the community effectively. And so some of these kinds of ideas are exactly the kinds of things that they found really powerful and valuable in the panel that I was on, which went through a variety of examples of how this works. Okay, so as lawyers, these are some key skills that you're going to need in dealing with these kinds of issues. And so, you've already looked at the Martin County problem through a variety of perspectives. Probably the introductory idea was to sort of get you to sort of think about it through different lenses, different ways of looking at the issue. But then eventually, as we work on these problems, we're going to ask, how, as you do your analysis, would you include cultural competence in what you're doing? Okay, so that's going to be key. Questions, commentary. So we've thought a lot about Martin County. I don't know if we've kind of actually come up with, I think, some good solutions, but that's a big. It's got it's a complex problem. We will now turn to grasslands and prairie dogs. Okay, and some of you will be like, yay, and some of you will be like, prairie dogs? But anyway, but this is a piece of, just part of understanding how environmental law works and so forth, and so you will come to love the cute little prairie dogs. But no, actually to see some of these issues from a broader systemic perspective. And then we'll turn to, we'll come back to Kentucky, to the Mississippi River Basin and nutrient runoff, and then we'll go in the last problem down to Tampa, Florida, to some urban environmental problems. All right. Any questions or anything? All right. So then I will see you on Wednesday to talk about the problem.